If you or someone you know has a story, encounter, or experience you would like to share with my viewers, please send it to my email at stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. Thank you. It was January of 2003 in Baxter County, Arkansas. It was around Highway 62 and the 101 intersection. It was around 2 or 3 in the morning, and it was a cold, clear winter night. I was coming home from fishing as we rounded the 30-mile-an-hour curve right before the stop sign. We were headed south on 101, and an animal walking upright came into clear view as he was in my high beams and was on the west side shoulder. My buddy Joe, who was with me, and I said not a word to one another. We were now at maybe 20 miles an hour as we watched this big critter who was standing upright take one step and went from the far side of the shoulder to the center line, where he paused for a moment, looked us up and down. Although we felt no fear from it, Joe and I each felt like he looked at each one of us, me first and then Joe, before turning his head straight. Then he leaned forward and put his knuckles on the pavement and swung his hips through his arms and was now on the far side of the east shoulder and was gone. I did not see anything. I did hear a lot though, and while in a boat fishing with 2 friends, we were along the shoreline joking around and trying to catch something when we heard a very large animal rustling in the woods. The animal and object was not at all that far from us, but we could not see due to the dense vegetation and the low light conditions. The creature did sound to be very large, and the thrashing of the vegetation became louder. The 3 of us in the boat did begin to speculate what we were hearing, and none of us were worried until we heard the shrill from this animal. It can only be described as very loud, bone-chilling, and did, in fact, strike fear in all of us. We began to pull our lines and start the boat ASAP to leave the area, and the animal began to run away from our location. I think the direction was southeast if I'm correct. We still could hear the animal moving through the dense vegetation at a fast pace with no apparent problem. The animal continued to shrill on occasion, stopping approximately every 200 or so yards. The distance the final shrill was heard at was approximately 1/4 to half a mile away through dense woods and vegetation, up a hill. The time frame which this took place in was so fast we were unable to think of an animal which could sound so large and have such a deep shrill, and of course move so fast. The shrill was not as any other animal I have ever heard, nor was it the 2 other people I was with. The shrill was later heard by me, approximately 2 years later while on my way home from work. I was listening to Art Bell, and Bigfoot was the topic, and somebody had an audio of a Bigfoot. When the audio was played, I again became afraid, speechless, and the hair on my neck stood up, and my eyes teared. When I was about 13 years old, I went trout fishing with my mother and aunt on the White River in Arkansas. We were staying at a motel in Bull Shoals. One morning, we drove to a remote area of the river to fish via an unknown dirt road. We stopped to fish a bend of the river. On the opposite side of the river, which was west, was a tall stone bluff with a slight overcrop from erosion. On the east side was flatter land with 12 to 20 foot thin scrub trees, about 20 to 30 feet from the water, as the river was low. While my mother and aunt were fishing off the bank, I decided to try my luck further up the river, about 300 yards away and just out of sight with my mother. While I was fishing along the bank, I began to hear rustling sounds in the trees and shrubs behind me. I looked in the direction of the noise and could see in the tops of these thin trees moving as if something were walking through them and pushing them to the side. But due to the thickness of the vegetation, I could not see what was actually moving the trees. I stood and observed this activity for 2 to 3 minutes. I began hearing grunting type sounds that were very deep and substantial sounding. These sounds were similar but different than grunt sounds a bull would make. The movement of the trees began to appear as if something were shaking the trees at this point, instead of moving through them. It appeared that Whatever was making the noises was only about 10 feet inside the brush, yet I could not see what it was. Feeling nervous, I decided whatever was in the brush moved with me, step for step. As I walked the movement in the trees, it seemed to be more forceful, with the sounds of large branches breaking as it moved. When I got within sight of my mom, which was about 50 yards, all activity stopped. I informed my mother there was something in the brush following me, but of course, she shrugged it off. Within a few moments, we decided to leave as we were not catching any fish. I was standing about 10 feet down in the forest, around a deep ravine, not really too far from the house, but it was right next to a patch of woods, going back further south into the national forest. The narrow patch of woods then stretched on northward. Leaves were on the ground. That was the first thing that impinged on my consciousness, the sound of something walking through leaves. It was a measured long tread, I could tell. I started really looking around, trying to see what was making those sounds. I was much braver back then. Then, over on the other side of the ravine, close to the bottom, but definitely walking uphill, I saw it. For all of about 3 seconds, seemed like longer at the time, and about 50 to 100 yards away, it was very large and I could see that it was hairy. I could see the ground between its moving legs, and some vague image of arms, but not the head. Some forest branch obscured my view of the very top part of the body. I could tell it was walking upright, uphill. It was not a bear. It was standing with a purpose up on the hill on the other side. It was quickly out of sight. Now, I know I wasn't thinking clearly, because I decided I had to try to get a better look at it. So I ran as quickly as I could around the rim of the ravine, since its origins began in our front yard, which is not the best playground, I can tell you. Anyway, it didn't take me long to reach the other side and move down into the woods slightly to look around and see if I can find it again. It did not see it again. I was there for only a minute or so when it suddenly occurred to me that I didn't hear anything anymore at all. No sounds, no birds, no nothing. And fear like I'd never known before hit me, and I went running, practically screaming back to the house. I told her what I'd seen, and she of course did not believe me, my mother, though she told me to never tell anyone else the story. For a long time, I didn't tell a soul, except family members, but of course, they didn't believe me. It didn't help that only 1 or 2 people since then truly believed that I saw a Bigfoot. Since then, I have had lots of trouble going out alone in the woods. While no one actually calls you a liar, they look skeptical, and you can tell they either think you've been drinking or drugging or saw a bear. In early to mid-October of 1981, I was 17 years old. I was working weekends in Fayetteville, a town 28 miles from where I lived in Siloam Springs. I usually left for work around 5:30 in the morning. I would drive the old Highway 68 towards Fayetteville, Springdale. One morning, I was on my way to work as I was coming close to where Fairmount Road was. I could see something by the bridge at first. I thought it was a coyote or a large dog scratching around the bridge with its back legs. As I got closer, I realized it was not, and that it was actually a Sasquatch. It was reddish-brown in color, and I could see its face area had almost no hair, and the skin tone was lighter than the rest of it. It looked up at me as I passed on over the bridge. My car was a Volkswagen Bug, and the lights were not very bright. It seemed to be startled. I looked into the rearview mirror to see it jump up and run across the road. It moved in long strides and very quickly. It was tall, maybe close to 7 feet, and was thinner than I would have expected it to be. The activity it seemed to be doing when I first saw it was digging at the ground next to the bridge. The motion it was using was similar to what primates do. The manner in which it moved across the road was, however, more like a human would move. Well, I live in Bentonville, Arkansas right now. My dad owned his own business. One day, we got on the subject. I was telling him that I had bought a little book of ghost stories and Bigfoot sightings and how I was very, very interested in Bigfoot. Then he told me that he had seen Bigfoot before and told me the whole story. At first, I didn't believe him, but a couple of years later, he told me the same story when we got on the topic again. The story is that he was riding ATVs with his friends around or in either Lost Bridge Lake over Beaver Lake, and he was at that front of the group of four-wheelers, and they were going down this hill that led to a dirt road. Since he was in the front of the group, he went down first and got on the dirt road and stopped to wait for the rest of the group to come down. Before they came down, he looked over across the dirt road on the other side of the hill, on the tree line where the evening sun was shining through the trees, and seen the Bigfoot walking. He said it was taking really big steps and appeared to be around 8 feet tall. He couldn't see the color because the sun was shining through the trees and Bigfoot, so it appeared as a shadow. Then the rest of the group came down, and he told them what he saw, and they did not believe him. That's all he told me. He told me he couldn't remember every detail, but he still knows more than me. I can't remember everything. The reason I'm telling you and not him is that I probably couldn't get him to tell you. I'm telling you this because I'm learning about Bigfoot in our biology class at Bentonville High School. My teacher is a marine biologist and a cryptozoologist. We watched the Bigfoot movie and the legend of Boggy Creek in class. In late November of 2000, my son and I were walking my terrier dog and looking for arrowheads along Beaver Lake. My dog began to follow a large and well-defined set of raccoon tracks along the lake shore. The shoreline was larger than usual due to the lack of rain. The morning was sunny with temperatures being about 50 degrees, sweatshirt weather. The raccoon tracks proceeded about 20 yards away from the water to an area of great disturbance in the packed sandy soil. Disturbance as in some type of scuffle. The raccoon tracks intersected with two sets of human-like footprints which had come from a nearby woodline. From the disturbance site, the human-type tracks returned to the woodline, but the raccoon tracks ceased to exist. We did not have a camera or tape measure, but one set of tracks were 16 to 17 inches long and about 5 to 6 inches across on the ball of the foot. The smaller set, which ran parallel to the larger, were about 11 inches in length and maybe 4 to 5 inches at the ball. The larger set were impressed in the soil about 4 inches and the smaller pair only a couple. These tracks were very flat in appearance as well. I weigh 130 pounds and my son 180. We left only faint impressions in the soil. We attempted to follow these tracks back the way they had come, but we lost sight of them in the forest as the ground was much firmer and covered with leaves. One final note. My terrier dog was whining and acting very unusual, defecating and urinating on the disturbance site, then attempting to cover the location with sand and dirt. Late one night, my wife and I decided to go on a moonlit walk on our property to find good spots to look up at the stars because we were considering on getting a telescope. We got into the car and drove the very end of our driveway and parked. Our driveway is approximately a quarter of a mile of the main road with thick woods on both sides. We started walking up the driveway. About halfway up, we felt like we were being watched. So we stopped and we started hearing very loud noises in the woods to our left. It sounded like something was running towards us. Shocked and panicked, my wife turned and started running back towards the vehicle. My wife, Reba, said this: "I wanted to get out there as fast as I could. I told my husband to come on, and he told me to go ahead. So I ran back to the car as fast as I could. I got into the car and locked the doors." Jason, the husband, continued the story. "After my wife ran back to the vehicle, I immediately got a flashlight out of my pocket to scan the woods. I did not feel comfortable turning my back on whatever this was. I smelled a foul in the air. It is hard to describe this odor. The best way to describe it is an overwhelming, nauseating odor It smelt like a mixture of roadkill and wet dog with a faint scent of sulfur. The best description of the sulfur smell is the smell after striking a match and blowing it out, but more potent. My heart was racing and my palms were sweaty. My senses were heightened and my body went into a state of alert from fear, which is not normal for me. I grew up my whole life hunting, entering the woods well before daylight and exiting the woods well after sundown. I know what deer sounds like running through the woods, and I'm familiar with local wildlife like bobcats, coyotes, raccoons, panthers, wild hogs. I'm not easily scared. There's been times that I have had to leave the woods with nothing but the backlight of a cell phone, so I don't scare easily. But this animal kept charging at me, a little bit at a time, and then it would stop and charge again. It was so loud that it sounded like a bull elephant coming through the woods at me. This was when I knew it was something that I had never heard before. I never did get a glimpse of the creature, and I did not see any eye shine. I searched high and low, scanning the woods. The animal had to be far enough into the woods to where I could not see it, but it sounded like it was right next to me, in the edge of the woods. At this point, I slowly backed up the hill, never turned around, and never showed my back, and always kept the flashlight on scanning the woods. Not knowing what to expect, I built up enough courage to shout out, "That's enough! Just stay back!" in a stern, loud voice. I doubt the creature understood anything I just said, but I was just hoping the tone I used would be enough to make it stop coming towards me. Then, shortly after I shouted, everything began to calm, and I think it understood that we were leaving the area. After feeling that I was being watched and pushed out of the area, I finally reached the top of the hill and felt it was safe to turn around, so I ran the rest of the way to the car. My wife had the doors locked, so I flashed my light and tapped on the window. She immediately unlocked the doors and I got in. Then she immediately locked the doors back, and we drove back up to the house. This was the first of many occurrences that happened on that property. It seemed that after this encounter, the activity picked up in the following months. I have heard many stories at deer camp about people seeing this creature, but I always dismissed it as folklore. But this experience made me realize that there is really something out there. This made me have the desire to look into it further and to do some of my own research, because I felt as if I were losing it. As I replay the events in my head, I try to make sense of it all, but the research I have done seems to bring me more questions than answers. On December 4th, 2005, at approximately 8:15 a.m., I was standing approximately 50 yards from the southwest corner boundary marker of my property when I heard the neighbor's dog start to bark and run southward toward Arkansas Highway 7. They only ran a short distance before stopping. I immediately thought that they must be barking at a deer that was crossing the road. My first thought was to get my gun from my truck. Then I remembered that I had parked outside the fence in front of my house. So, I decided to just stand there and see if it was a doe or a buck, and hope it would not feel pressured since the dogs had stopped barking. I also believed the deer would just change directions if it saw me hurrying in its same general direction. Therefore, I just stood still and waited in hopes of getting a glimpse of it. Then, if the dogs would keep quiet, I could hunt it later. Only one got to see it for 2 to 3 seconds, but I saw it clearly. My first impression was that I was observing a very large man who was wearing a hooded black parka. Then I realized it was some kind of animal. It was approximately 50 yards away and was on the opposite side of an old fence that had been overtaken by grass, weeds, and vines. I only had a left side view of it as it was traveling east along an old fence row. It covered a distance of about 20 yards in just 3 seconds. I could only see its upper body. I could see that it was not a bear, but I couldn't make out distinct facial features from the side from that distance. It was like an ape in some ways, but its posture appeared more man-like. I can best describe the size by comparing it to a very large man I know who is approximately 6'9" and weighs 280. This creature was at least that tall. Possibly a little taller, but close to that same build. I did not get a long view of it, I probably would not have had the time to take a picture, even if I would have had a camera in my hand. It was moving at a very brisk pace, but not lightning fast. Its stride resembled a trot or even a jog. The body was moving quickly, but there was no up and down motion. It appeared to have a moderately thick coat of black hair. From what I could tell, its face was dark too, as if there was some hair on the face. It was moving through a well-used deer crossing. There's an old fence row there, on both sides of Arkansas Highway 7. The west fence row had recently been cleared and the east side was logged about 5 years ago, and has a fair amount of undergrowth and a game trail running along the south side of the fence row. Just a little to the southwest of the spot, there is a thicket that is approximately 3 acres in size. There are a couple partial open areas in the woods there. Most parts of this thicket can be walked through fairly easily. In places the thicket is too thick to move through without clippers and/or a machete. I did not see where the creature crossed Arkansas Highway 7, but it most likely came from an area that is about 40 yards away from the highway's west side right-of-way. I believe that this creature waited until there were no cars coming before crossing the road. I did not get the impression that it was running from something. I have mentally replayed the entire scenario many times, and I have stood and looked at the same area where the creature was seen. I looked for tracks after the incident, but the ground was too brushy for obvious tracks. I've stood in the spot where I observed the creature from. I've watched as vehicles traveled north along Arkansas Highway 7 and considered every other possible scenario. It wasn't any kind of illusion. I was there, and I saw it. Wednesday, October 12th, 2005. Our neighbor's dog were very active and barking all night. The next morning about 5:30 a.m., my own dog was barking in the backyard. I opened the door to calm her down, and I heard something in the back of our property, near the fruit trees. It was very heavy sounding, and I could hear branches breaking as it departed. The next morning around 8:30, my husband went to his truck in the backyard and heard something behind our shop take off running. He thought it was a hunter and ran to the back to listen. He thought it sounded like it was on 2 feet. He said it stomped very heavily as it was running through the woods, and he could hear snorting. Sunday, October 16th, I went walking around the neighborhood road and discovered several sets of large and small bare footprints on the gray slate road in front of our house. At first, I thought it was a child's footprint, until I looked closer. There were 2 sets. The largest measured 13.5 by 7 inches, and the small print measured 9 by 4 inches. I took pictures of all the prints and measured each one. They consistently measured the same size. The large print is about 3 inches wider than my husband's foot, and he's a rather big man. Several friends and myself had gone together to purchase 120 acres of cut-over forest land that was totally surrounded by several thousand acres of timber company land. This land was at the end of a small valley and at the far end of a dead-end road. On my portion of the land was a small rise in the northern half of the valley, and I was working on building a shack to be used for hunting and camping. One night, about 8 p.m., while working inside by lantern light, I decided to step outside on the deck for a cigarette. As soon as I lit my lighter, a roaring, crackling scream commenced from the slope of the ridge to the south, about 300 yards away, but in direct line of sight. I was too startled to do anything but stay rooted to the spot and feel the hair stand up on the back of my neck, something which hasn't happened to me in years. While the scream lasted for only a couple of seconds, it seemed to go on for very, very long. Since it was very cloudy and dark, I ran inside for a flashlight, all the while wishing I had brought my rifle inside from the truck. With a flashlight and a hatchet, I headed for the truck only to find that the truck itself seemed to be moving. In the bed of the truck, I found my German Shepherd. I had forgotten all about him, curled in a tight ball in the corner and shaking so hard he was moving the whole truck. We left immediately. Several nights later, One of the friends who had laughed at me when I told the story came out to see how I was progressing with the shack. He laughed more at the extra lanterns I had placed inside and outside, and at the pistol and shotgun I had laying on the table. We stepped out onto the lit deck, and almost immediately the same grating scream came at exactly the same spot on the south ridge. In a flash, my friend was standing back to back with me as we stared out into the dark. Since the dog was not with us, and because we were armed and had good flashlights, we stayed there for about 2 more hours, but heard nothing else. But I was certainly glad to have a witness this time. Several weeks later, my friend and I ran into one of the other property owners and were relating the story to him when I noticed him becoming a bit pale. He finally told us that he had been burning piles of deadfall on his part of the property that butts into the south ridge, and was walking back and forth to the stream to get water to put out several of the fires when he heard something walking around him in the woods. It was too dark to see, but he at first assumed it was a deer or maybe a bear. After he had listened for a while, he decided it sounded like a 2-legged creature and believed it was one of us trying to play a joke on him. So, he continued putting out his fires while listening to whatever it was make a circle around him. But when it got upwind from him, he began to smell a terrible odor that he admitted scared him so badly that he got in his truck and left, ignoring his still smoldering fires. I cannot say what it was that we heard or what the other man had smelt, but I have heard several kinds of big cats, bears, howler monkeys, and other large animals in my years hunting and in the army, and I have never heard anything that sounded remotely like what was heard those 2 nights. My children and I were driving back from my mother's home in Cushman, Arkansas, on Thanksgiving Day around 10 p.m. We were approaching Newark on Highway 65 South. Just outside, Macedonia Road turns off the highway to the left. We had to stop for traffic as we came up on that road. There were 2 cars in front of us. The one in front was waiting to turn left onto the road. There were 3 cars in oncoming traffic, and 1 car on the road waiting to turn left onto Highway 65 toward Newark. As our truck slowed due to the stopped traffic ahead of us, I saw something very dark in a crouched position behind the car directly in front of us. As the vehicle started to move, the figure stood and stepped all in one motion off the side of the highway. It was on 2 legs and taller than the cab of our full-size pickup. In the crouched position, it was taller than the hood of my truck. You could see the profile of a head, shoulders, back, buttocks, legs, and arms swinging wide. I was speechless. My daughter, 11 at the time, also saw the figure and said, "Did you see that?" as she locked her door. I was a major skeptic until this. It really left me scratching my head. I'd heard stories of sightings around here, but never believed any of them until now.